as a weapon of war has become a defining characteristic of the conflicts of the Great Lakes region of Africa. It has been widely documented by media and human rights groups. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, numerous armed groups have used sexual violence as a tool to terrorize their enemies, with some estimates saying that 1 out of 3 women in the Eastern DRC are survivors of rape. Aid workers have dubbed it the worst place in the world to be a woman.
Rape is used here as a weapon of war to torture and humiliate hundreds of thousands of women and girls.
The Lord's Resistance Army has abducted thousands of girls in Uganda, Sudan, and the DRC to use as sex slaves.
I think the women has been the most affected by war. The woman has been reduced to nothing.
Responding to the heinous nature of violence against women in Rwanda, an international criminal tribunal determined that rape could constitute an act of genocide.
In this war against women, his hospital is the front line.
So one of them are here.
One of the latest victims is Sifa Mikatambala. She was raped 2 days ago by soldiers who raided her village.
Everybody understands that there's a war against women in the Congo.
A war against women.
Join runforcongowomen.org to build hope and opportunities for some of the more than 1,200 women and children brutalized daily by the war in Congo. Your 3-mile run will have a 7,000-mile impact.
For governments and aid agencies in the region, the term sexual and gender-based violence has become shorthand for describing violence targeting women. But what about the other gender?
So women suffer more than men in terms of SGBV.
Women, okay, we're talking about SGBV, it's sexual, to say gender-based violence, okay, sexual, woman, gender, woman, the violence against women.
It's domestic violence, which is being practiced always by men. By men.
Who does it? Especially men.
Many of the humanitarian workers and many of the human rights workers will tell you that it's dangerous to take the focus off of women and onto men because it may draw resources away.
How do you get away from that view that women are automatically vulnerable and men are not?
In late 2008, the militia National Congress for the Defense of the People swept through the small village of Kiwanja in the eastern DRC, went house to house locating all the men and boys of fighting age and murdered them.
Gender-based violence is any harm that's directed at an individual against his or her will, which contains an element of gender, which is aimed at them because they are male or they are female. Typically it's thought of in the context of women, so the obvious examples are something like domestic violence, for example, or the rape of women. However, it can also equally easily be targeting men, and examples of that would be sex-selective massacres, in which only men are targeted to be killed.
The Tutsi rebels came and told us to stay in our houses, that they would protect us. Then they came back and killed us from our doorsteps. This we cannot accept.
Many of the conflicts involve conflicts over identities, ethnic identities, political identities, and trying to define who's in and who's out, and who's worthy, who's not worthy. Humiliation is quite a key issue. How do you humiliate and prove that those who are out, that they should be out? and how do you prove that you as the in-group are superior, more powerful, etc.? I mean, how do you establish your supremacy, your right to control? And a lot of that seems to be achieved through particular forms of violence. The use of sexual violence, I think, is very much about kind of going right to the heart of individual and group sense of self.
How many women has he raped?
7. Katakatana. Kwa udogo ni 8.
The soldier may fuck your wife or your children, elder daughter of yours.
A soldier can find a family of them.
I know in the Congo, the soldiers would come in and make the man lie down as a mattress, and then make the wife lie down on the man, and she would be raped while the children watched.
Also did the same thing.
Those in the night, they would storm into the house and tie up the men, and they rape your wife. When they are done, they would untie you and you remain with her. And you would just watch? Would you accept? Yes. What would you do? They have tied you and they have the gun. If you resist, they kill you. We are cowards. We feel bad, and that's why we all left.
Rape and gender-based violence typically play a role in all conflict. They are frequently used to humiliate the enemy by showing his weakness and his inability to protect his women. In this conception, the enemy is seen as male, and women are a tool aimed at destroying the males. Essentially, rape defined as war waged on men.
Implicit in the rape of a woman is a critique of the men who are unable to protect her. So if you attack the women, you're also basically saying something quite powerful about the weakness and the inability of the men to do what they're supposed to do as men.
So the paradigm that we are working with currently internationally is one in which rape is primarily a women's issue, and it affects men indirectly. Finally, men are often forced to witness the rape and sexual violence targeted at women who they feel obligated to protect. There is also the potential for men in war to be forced to commit atrocities against their loved ones. So, for instance, to rape their mothers or sisters or other relatives in a very public way in order, again, to destroy the community trust and bonds and family bonds that exist.
This refugee relates her experience with soldiers from the Rwandan Patriotic Army.
Even now, when I see a uniform of a soldier, I don't feel well. They came in, they found us in the sitting room. They beat me and kicked me in the back. They dragged me to the ground. In full view of my children, they undressed me and raped me. They took my brother, a young man, and they tried to force him to rape me. My brother refused because in the Rwandan culture, a brother can never sleep with a sister. He refused, he ran, he managed to get out, but one of the soldiers followed and shot him, and he died.
Photographer Susan Schulman has just returned.
Stories of men being forced to watch or participate in the rape of family members have not featured in media narratives on the conflicts of the Great Lakes region. If it is reported, men are viewed as secondary victims, not the direct target of psychological violence.
But when I arrived at my house, when my husband saw me and realised I'd been raped, he wouldn't let me in the house. He wouldn't even talk to me. He didn't even look at me. He just pushed me aside and left.
It represents the first chance women here have ever had to talk about why what is happening to them is wrong, and the first chance also for their husbands and families to see them as more than a piece of property.
Even more uncommon is coverage of men that are directly targeted by other men. This Congolese refugee was arrested and thrown in prison amongst the very soldiers he had been investigating.
They started by torturing us, beating us. They tore our clothes, and in that darkness we were thrown on the cement. There were many soldiers. I don't know the number. There were many soldiers who slept with me. That's to say, had sexual intercourse with me, whether in my ears, my anus, my mouth, wherever they wanted. They would screw me. These were things which I could not imagine ever happening, but they happened. It is something which, when I think about it, causes me a lot of trauma. A lot of trauma. One doesn't really know how to live as one did before. It's a sort of vengeance, a sort of humiliation, a way of attacking our identity, so they could diminish us in society. What did they say while they were torturing and raping you? They said many things, but it was in Lingala. But when you translate it, you can see that they wanted to show that they were superior to us, that we were worth nothing, that this time round they were putting us in the place of women. You know that in society they say that men dominate and women are inferior. So they said to us that we are going to show you that you are women, that you are not men like us. That is what they wanted to affirm through their actions that they committed on us.
Acholi soldiers were largely blamed for atrocities committed in central Uganda while fighting the rebel insurgency of President Yoweri Museveni. In northern Uganda, after Museveni's National Resistance Army took power in 1986, some of his soldiers sought revenge by using sexual violence against Acholi men. It was widespread enough that the Acholi invented new vocabulary to describe this new tactic. Tekgum, the way which is hard to bend.
And there's one particularly notorious battalion, I think Battalion 118, that was based in Gulu district for a period of about 5 years and was well known for deliberately going out and raping men. And has become very notorious as a result.
We don't know why they did that, but the interpretation was that it was to show these people that they have totally conquered them, so that they were able now to sleep with their wives, their daughters, including they themselves. And that is something that has caused a lot of grievances, and up to date, people are not being very happy about that type of thing which happened to them. The knowledge that people were brutalized, including the sexual abuse, has been reported by other independent human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. It has been documented elsewhere. And the fact that men were also homosexual assaulted has come out. But the government itself have not come up to acknowledge or to say sorry about it.
They started collecting both men and women from a place called Badege and gathered them in the school, St. Martin. They were sodomizing the men, and sometimes they would pick your wife while you were watching, and they would dehumanize her in different ways. They would enter any house and defecate in your water pots, and even in your maize flour, or any foodstuff they would come across.
This Acholi elder was hospitalized for 2 months after being gang raped on 9 different occasions.
3 men were bending me over many times over the course of 9 days. They would just come into my compound. After stealing my goats and chickens, they would then come to sodomize me. They came back and did this until all the chickens and goats were gone. I know they were government soldiers. During the act, they would not say anything. One of them stabbed me with the bayonet on his rifle. It's God who helped me, otherwise I would have died.
When sexual violence is meted out against men, it's, often it's seen in terms of essentially as a message that, as a man who has been sexually violated, you're no longer a man. You've been made into a woman by the sexual act. In a very sort of gendered, very patriarchal setting, it's probably the most fundamental way in which you can attack a man is to say you're not a man.
The counseling section sees about 10 clients on a daily basis, and of those 10, 7 of them report having suffered from some form of sexual and gender-based violence. So it takes a lot more of time, patience, and acceptance on the part of the men to come out than on the part of the women, because SGBV is more taken to be a women's affair.
Here I don't have hope, and even I don't have the reason to go back to my country, because
how can a man admit before a counselor that he was sexually violated? It's very difficult. It takes a lot of courage, it takes patience, it takes time. So sometimes they will tell you other stories of what they've gone through, but somehow you get a gut feeling that they are not saying something.
So which settlement were you staying in?
Me? Right now we don't have a settlement.
But a man is not supposed to share out his problems. They often say a man is not supposed to cry. He should be able to stand the heat of every problem. Now that is something men think that is their personal problem, and they shouldn't bring it out.
When they came to take us out, my body was covered in blood. I had pain everywhere on my body. In my anus and ears, I had wounds. There was even so much sperm on my body that the doctor who was sent to examine me was scared to touch me.
When this Congolese refugee gave his testimony to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees on the violations he underwent while in prison, he felt he was not taken seriously. They were more interested in the case of his daughter, who had also been raped.
They talked a lot more about the rape of my daughter than about my own case. I was tortured, I was raped, but they believe that rape is not done to men. That's what I was able to observe. I know from criminology what constitutes a rape, but I guess at that level there is not sufficient knowledge that this can be done to men too. When you explain this problem, people don't listen to you. They don't listen. They are indifferent. I had the bad luck of being interviewed by female protection officers who were unable to grasp that I was a victim of rape. And that just creates further trauma. One lives that every day. When you say, I was persecuted, I experienced this in my country, they respond, but you're a man, you can't be raped. So that's where it stops.
Go and talk about it, who's going to believe you? You see, I mean, there is also that issue about people not really believing that, male would do that to male. There isn't the public talk about it, one. Awareness is also very little, and interventions, if any, are just almost nil. And I guess also possibly if someone goes and reports, they'll think, oh no, you're complacent in this, and you're not a victim, but you're a party. So you go and report yourself, you might even end up being a party to a charge of having been engaged in acts of sodomy or something like that.
Currently within Uganda, there are effectively no legal recourses for men who have been raped. The Ugandan Penal Code defines rape and sexual indecent assault in such a way that it can only be perpetrated against a woman. All the definitions have the word woman in them. Were a man to seek legal recourse, he would have to do that under ordinary assault or perhaps under the unnatural offenses provisions, which are essentially provisions against homosexuality. To my knowledge, this has never been done through Ugandan courts, and it's clear that the reason for that is because of the huge stigma attached.
Cultural pressure on men to hide their vulnerabilities, combined with the tremendous stigmatization of homosexuality as unnatural and foreign across the region, has left many police officers, doctors, nurses, and other protection officials incapable or unwilling to understand male vulnerability to sexual violence.
When the question is explicitly posed of what happens when a male victim comes forward, the answer that I can recall is a giggle along with the words, "We don't have such cases." So this is clearly not true.
The doctor is going to scrutinize you. How did you happen to go through this experience, and where were you? Maybe you wanted it, and all that kind of thing. The first conclusion is this must be a homosexual. That attitude alone is problematic, and it makes it very, very difficult, and that's why sometimes people don't go for treatment.
Even to be seen as a homosexual by the police can prove very dangerous. Sexual minorities face repeat visits to prison cells on the most spurious of charges, while police officers justify their actions as freeing the streets of a public nuisance.
The gay men who are transgenders or who look feminine, yeah, they will be targeted. So sometimes in the middle of the night they can come and open the cell, take out the homosexuals and beat them. Your homosexuals, they beat you because they would come back when they have bruises and sometimes swollen.
But there's nothing I fear like police, because here they take us in to kill us. It's not like 1 week in prison and you can go back home. Thieves, they'll say you're maybe looking for food, so you'll be there 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then you'll go back home, and they'll say don't do it again. But for homosexuals, they'll say you are spoiling people, you are bad omens, you are bringing disease, you just keep being in prison. That's why I fear police.
What happens in a patriarchal society where men are not permitted to be vulnerable and where at the same time their masculine identities are clearly under attack? At the moment, there is little understanding of this problem, and as a result, there is even less hard data to help us understand its scope. One study found that among male former combatants in Liberia, 1/3 of them reported having experienced some form of sexual violence. Could the prevalence be as high in the Great Lakes region? Could it be higher? There is a wealth of information on conflict and its effects on women, but there is correspondingly very little research on men. Might it be important to understand how protracted conflicts affect masculinity? Or how targeting masculine identities might create further violence? In war, if an individual can be emasculated, can an entire community? After 20 years of insecurity and living in crowded internal displacement camps, the Acholi people of northern Uganda have had to adapt to their surroundings. Rural people were taken from their land and livelihoods and forced into guarded camps where they were made completely dependent on foreign aid and inadequate protection by the state. Unexpectedly, the roles of men and women in the community began to change.
I'm from Western Uganda. To us, a man should be, we look at him as the overall family head, someone with the capacity to build a home, marry a wife, and take care of his children. When you look at a refugee setting, man doesn't efficiently carry out his roles. We now have men becoming more idle. Idle in a way that they know every month WFP will give me the food. I don't need to fend for the family. They know the schools are free, the medical services are free. So it's not like in any normal setting where a man knows I'm supposed to get up, look for all the basics that my family needs. In my culture, what they say, it's like he is a he, she. Ideally, he's a man but according to the roles he's supposed to play, he is not a man. You've ever heard some people say, so and so is a man just because he puts on a trouser. That means he has failed to play his role as a man.
A good husband makes sure he provides you with a livelihood that can be able to sustain the home. He should be able to provide for you, and when you bear children, he should be able to help in raising the children in a healthy environment. Many cannot do that. Only a few can. They say there is no money to take the children to school. Because of no money, they resort to drinking alcohol. And have you ever seen such a hopeless man as this one? What can he do for his children? Most men are like that. You imagine all these children are your responsibility as a woman, and you have to draw a budget to take care of them as a woman. At the height of the conflict, Acholi men were completely confined to the camps. If they ventured out, they risked abduction by the LRA or arrest by government soldiers. It was only the women that could live to tend to their gardens and gather firewood. Slowly, economic power shifted to the women. As camp life wore on, women began managing household finances, rearing animals, and using pedal bicycles, all activities that would have been considered manly before the camps. Women earned income by brewing alcohol, which the men readily drank. Men began fetching water, cooking, and gathering firewood when they could, all traditional female duties. While the emerging role of women as breadwinners in northern Uganda was trumpeted by the international community as gender justice, not enough is known about its corresponding effect on men.
The traditional view of masculinity, that the man is the provider, the protector, the woman is the nurturer, etc. And it's within the framework of marriage that you provide for your women, you provide for your children, and you protect them. If you look at a conflict situation, that first element of marriage becomes very, very difficult. And if you can't get married, then who are you supposed to provide for? Who are you supposed to protect? Even those people who they've done that first step, they are formally married, it's recognized that they're married. The capacity to provide when you're in a refugee camp or an IDP camp, the providing role becomes very, very problematic. And it's often further taken out of your hands by aid agencies who deliver aid directly to women in the interests of their vision of gender equality and redressing these kind of patriarchal social systems.
Recognizing the shifts developing in the camps, aid agencies began distributing food aid directly to the women, who they regarded as more responsible and more capable heads of households. The agencies were now complicit in de-emphasizing the role of men in the family and the community. And by now, the community looked very unhealthy.
The Acholi culture looks at a man as the head of the household. A man should fend for his household, a man should protect his household. And therefore, with the conflict, this kind of disrupted that system that was already in place to protect the young people, to protect the women as well. And therefore you find that the roles of the man kind of were switched with that of the woman. And men are beginning to realize the need to address the social disruptions that were brought about by the war. And they're beginning also to realize that they really need to enforce their power at the household. So this is what we are beginning to see, and this is what has been cited as has also a cause of violence in the home, especially domestic violence, because of this reassertion of the power that the men once lost.
There is one study which was done by UNICEF, and they found that in Pabo camp, which was one of the largest camps, at least 60% of all the females were sexually abused. So in a way, the majority of females actually in all these camps continue to undergo sexual violence on a daily basis. And that is almost a projection of so much annoyance and grievances which people could not deal with. And the fact that the camp, you can see the way it is. The fact that the camps have these houses very close together. And in the situation where people are really frustrated, many people believe that is part of the things you need to do in order to forget what you are going through. So sexual abuse becomes a norm.
There is violence against others, and then there is violence against oneself. A lot of the suicides in the camps have been the result of domestic pressures or divorce or separation of the family. For the men, it is often because they fail to marry. The women here follow the soldiers as a last resort. They know it's better than sitting in the camp and starving.
But the interpretation of pretty much every single suicide case that I came across, the interpretation given to it by people associated with it or observers of that suicide, was always in terms of problems with the individual's gender role and gender identity. And that was true in one way or another of both men and women. So you'd get men whose wives had left them to go with a soldier who'd try and commit suicide as a result. You'd get women whose husbands were not providing, were not protecting, and had basically given up and resorted to alcohol. And those women feeling so desperate because they couldn't actually bring up their families. They couldn't bring up their families because their husbands had failed them. They were committing suicide.
Lacking alternatives, men in areas of protracted conflict can see the military as the only means to economic and physical security. When the Ugandan army went into South Sudan in 2004 to fight the LRA, they had little trouble recruiting thousands of disempowered northern men into their ranks, despite the fact that northern Uganda is solidly opposed to the current regime. The government has further militarized these men by organizing numerous paramilitary groups known as local defense units. This is worrying, as many see militarization as an impediment to lasting peace in the region.
Within most stable communities that are at peace, over time people are permitted some flexibility in terms of their identities. The community has enough stability and enough safety to accommodate difference, and it is able to account for personal differences. There may be several different ways for a man to be a man in a community. For instance, it may be through education, it may be through access to resources if they happen to be a particularly good business person, it may be through physical strength, it may be through athletic prowess. There's a number of ways that men can express their masculinity. In conflict, many of those ways are taken away, and the only experience that many, especially younger men, have of masculinity is through the gun, through the use of violence.
So, the whole community entire thing.
The rebels came into our village with guns. They did bad things in the village. They mistreated people. They stole property. The whole community felt those with guns would just continue mistreating the village. So those who were young, those who were strong, decided to join the army.
So in places like northern Uganda, the only way in which you can really provide protection is by joining the army, by joining the rebels, or by joining local defense units or militias. You have to militarize in order to fulfill that part of the kind of masculine role that you've been socialized into.
I joined the army because the rebels had killed my parents and the rest of my family while I was at school. That's why I joined. I joined to go and fight those who kill people. For my manhood, I cannot allow you to come into my home and kill my father. If you come with a gun to kill my father, I will kill you.
Vulnerability, victimization, and militarization are linked. So if you don't deal with the vulnerability and the victimization and acknowledge it and take steps to address it, militarization is likely to follow.
The vulnerabilities of men amid the conflicts in this part of Africa are not fully understood. Far from directly having their needs addressed, men are often seen as the source of the problem. And the governments and organizations meant to understand sexual and gender-based violence often seem comfortable working under the assumption that men are always the perpetrators and women are always the victims.
When you say that you've been raped by men, by soldiers, the people you are talking to, let's say protection officers, or agents of humanitarian organizations, they believe you are making it up. Whereas I've lived it personally, my professional experience does not allow me to lie about such things. But I've seen that there is a lack of comprehension. One would say that people don't know that the rape of men even takes place. You feel that psychologically you're loaded, and that your case is not taken seriously. You feel even more of a victim, and that you're being ostracized for reasons which you cannot explain, even though it's a real case, a real case.
Support groups for women survivors of sexual violence are a common feature in refugee settlements and internal displacement camps. They are readily initiated and sponsored through donor money funneled into the region under the cause of gender equality. In Changwari refugee settlement, we found one support group organized for men. The men were encouraged to sign pledge cards vowing not to abuse their wives and daughters.
Men are not a priority. That men, if they're considered at all, are considered to be perpetrators, or they're seen as people who need to be engaged in order to prevent violence against women.
Most of us go in there talking to women and just looking at women as the survivors and the victims, and not really talking to the men or addressing our questions and our interventions to the men. That's why they say, what about us? What about us if it happens to us? And you kind of laugh, oh yeah, you might be the perpetrator but not the victim.
It seems to be more feasible to get support systems going with women who have suffered sexual violence, and I think that's simply a reflection of the fact that the discussion about violence against women is much further advanced than the discussion about violence against men. Once we start to move those kind of processes forward in the discussion about violence against men, both sexual violence but also these other forms of gender-based violence, my feeling is that we will realize that the extent of the problem is far greater than has been acknowledged up to now. Because at the moment, much of the work that is done on gender is really like a sledgehammer. You know, it's crude, and it doesn't do justice to women, and it doesn't do justice to men either. You know, how do you get away from that view that women are kind of automatically vulnerable, men are not, and women are very, like, you know, they can be considered in the same breath as children. And if you're really concerned about addressing violence against women, you have to work not just with telling men to behave better, but trying to address the reasons why they became violent in the first place. What is the linkage between vulnerability and violence? You become violent when you're at your most vulnerable, because it's the last thing that you've got left. It's the only way that you can actually achieve anything is through violence, because all the other non-violent routes are closed to you.
What we need to do is to hear more from men. We need to know the impact of the war from the point of view of men, how they felt about it. It is very important that we begin engaging men to talk more about what happened to them from their own perspective.
If you don't have a full picture and you leave certain legacies of violence untouched, they're likely to lead to other violations. We know that victims become perpetrators if certain interventions are not made.